Hi there! How are you? Oh, no, baby!
You're my best side kids. How are you?
How you doing? Oh, good. Good having you. Well, welcome to our Glen Annie Canyon home. We're in the middle of 113 acres of orchard here, and we want to take some pictures of the mountains and the ocean, which is underneath the fog. And the other thing you should know is that this is where I've been living for 26 years, and I intend to live here for the rest of my life. We're also in a so-called agricultural preserve. It's about 6,000 acres all surrounding us that's dedicated to agriculture. Hopefully in perpetuity, but certainly during the rest of our lives. And you can, I would suggest you take a few shots of it so you can see where we are, and then we'll go back to the office and do some reminiscing so that you know, your dad, my son, is going back to his roots, and we'll tell him a little bit about grandfather and tell him a little bit about what his life was like and what my life has been like and what we hope to see from the next couple of generations. Yeah, there you are. We're now sitting in my office in our home at 777 Glen Annie Canyon Road in Goleta, which is, of course, a suburb of Santa Barbara. And this is a real honest-to-goodness working office with all the files of our various enterprises, including the ranching, and I'm surrounded by photographs of my wife, my children, my grandchildren, and my stepchildren, and there's a picture, a prominent picture of my father, GB or Giovanni Battista Cavalletto, who came to the United States from Italy and founded the family here in Goleta. And as you know, son, I had a sister who was 9 years older than I am, who passed away some 25 years ago. And I also had a brother who passed away 5 years ago, and who was 7 years older than I am, and I had my problems, but I'm still surviving. Anyway, we're reminiscing first about your grandfather, my late father, who passed away in 1955. He was preceded in death by my mother, who passed away when I was just barely 12, right after the Santa Barbara earthquake in 1925. She died of breast cancer, which wasn't diagnosed in those days until just before she died. My dad died in 1955. He had come to the United States and with a couple of $100 that he had borrowed from an uncle. He was 16 years old when he got permission to leave Italy and come emigrate to the United States, and he had to have an adult with him, and his brother, who was just 21, named Michael Cavalletto, came with him, and they arrived in Santa Barbara in middle of November in 1892. My father had his 17th birthday right after they arrived on November 22nd of 1892. The reason they'd come to Santa Barbara was that they had an uncle here, Uncle Lodovico, who had preceded them and had come to Santa Barbara and established Santa Barbara's first hotel, or really a boarding house. And he let it be known that any of the next generation that was able to make it to the United States, he'd be sure that he could put them up and be sure they didn't starve, and try and help them find a job. So my dad arrived, and I remember he said that he had, of the $200 he had borrowed, he had $1.97 left. Yet, interestingly, he came with Cavalletto spelled with 2 L's, like yours is spelled and like mine is spelled. But the other branch of the family, his brother, has only 1 L in his Cavalletto, and it's been carried on that way ever since. They came in 2 different immigration lines at Staten Island, and one immigration officer put the name down with 1 L, and the other one put it down with 2 L's, and they never dared change it. Anyway, my dad and his brother's first job that I guess the uncle helped them find was for the winter of 1892 into the spring of 1893, and it was, interestingly, cutting oak wood for sale for Alfonso Dan, who was the son of a original grantee from the Mexican government. And where they cut wood in the winter of 1892 and 93 is only a little over a quarter of a mile from where we're sitting, just north of us toward the mountains. And their arrangement was that they lived in a tent, and they lived on cheese and salami and whatever they cooked in an outdoor fire, and they lived in the tent to protect them against the rain, and they were expected to cut a cord of wood each day, and they received for that the sum of $20 per month each, and obviously they paid for their own food and their own lodging in their tent. This was his first job, and it lasted until the next summer, when they went in. Both of them went into their first love, that of the soil, and obviously they couldn't afford to buy any land, but they went to work for others, and Dad, GB, ultimately, or within I think the first year, managed to get a couple of horses, and this enabled him to work with his team during the next few years. He tried renting land, and because of not having enough rain, he'd have some real difficulties. And I remember his telling me that he managed to pay his uncle back that had loaned him the $200, but he went down to zero in his assets about 3 times before he was married in 1902. And during the years before he was married, he, for a brief time, ran a restaurant, was the cook and waiter and sole proprietor and sole employee, I guess, of this restaurant. That was not for him. It lasted about 5 months, and he gave it up and went back to his love of farming. And in 1896, 97, 98, he rented some fair amount of acreage in the Hope Ranch area, where you remember you did the bulk of your growing up, along with your sister Patty, and he tells the story of, or relates how in 1897 they had very little rainfall, and the rain table showed that we only got a little over 4 inches, and he had a couple of 100 acres of hay growing, and he was about to give up, and lo and behold, on the 10th or 12th of May of 1897, they had about an inch of rain, and this saved the hay crop and brought him to where he could survive. And in, I think it was the next year, they formed the Laguna Blanca, which you of course remember very well, and where Patty had such a good time fishing. And it's now dry, by the way, because we're having a drought. And when they were about to form that lake, they were about to drown some 6 or 7 acres of his hay. And the man he was renting it from said, well, you're going to have to ruin your hay crop on that 5 or 6 acres, but I'll give you $25. And he felt that really wasn't enough, so he, for the first time in his life, saw a lawyer. And this lawyer was Judge Richards, who was the founder of Santa Barbara's oldest law firm. And Dad told him that I really ought to get $50. And Judge Richard told him, well, after hearing the whole story, I think you're right, but to represent you, I'd have to charge you $50, so you take the 25 and be satisfied with it. And my dad always said that's the best legal advice he ever had. So, as I mentioned before, he said that he'd gone just about broke 3 times before he was married. After he was married, things always were reasonably profitable, and he managed to accumulate some land for himself, and ultimately for his children, and ultimately for his grandchildren. In before he was married, he in November of 1902, he made it what he called an inventorio generale, which is a general inventory of Mr. G.B. Cavalletto. And he listed on there 3 horses worth a total of $275, giving a value of each one, 2 cows worth $40 and $15, and 2 pigs worth $8 and $7, 110 chickens, and so much hay, so much bean straw, and interestingly, his biggest single item of material type was 920 gallons of wine, and which he valued at $784. The lima bean straw that he had was 6 tons of it, and he valued that at $300. And he had all kinds of tools, and but he was, and I'm holding his book in his own handwriting. He was reasonably liquid. He had denari al banco, meaning money in the bank, $1,194.50. And his total value just before he was married was $3,084.40. And then down below he lists what he owed. And he apparently had borrowed $103 from his uncle, and so he owed $103, and he also owed for expenses that had been advanced to him by Dreyfus, $56. And he, interestingly, in his book, follows a recipe for making salami and using the other parts of the pig. And that goes on for a couple of pages, and one of the things that, even though we don't make the salami, we do make ravioli, which came from a recipe that was in the family since the 1700s, and we very recently had a party for 109 people at my niece's place, in which everybody helped make the ravioli, and where we had Italian music, and it was a fine party, where my dad, during his lifetime, worked day in and day out, and he accumulated from 1903 until his demise in 1955, several ranches, and he gave some acreage to each one of his children, and they all did profitable things with those ranches, having developed them and so forth, and we're sitting on one which on top of a hill, which came from my dad. When he presented these in 1929, he said that mother had passed away, and he had accumulated all that she had ever inherited in her community property, and said that this is her share, and I'm passing this on to the 3 of you, the 3 children. I was still not an adult in 1929. I just finished high school, so it was kept in joint tenancy until I became 21, and this ranch was then sort of Wild Hills, but I had it rented out to a man who raised beans, and winter peas. I rented it for $1,000 a year, and I paid the taxes, the property taxes, which were then less than $100. And with working during the summer, I managed to go through the University of California with about $1,200 a year. And when I went to law school, I raised the rent by $200 because I had additional expenses. So my father's helping, and his influence gave me an education. I'm the first one of our family to have ever gone to university, and I ultimately, of course, went to law school and ultimately practiced law for 40 years before I retired some 13 years ago. My dad, before he passed away, starting in 1953, started passing some properties over to the grandchildren, always in equal shares, and when he passed away, his will left everything in equal shares to his 7 grandchildren, some of whom were minors, and I acted with my brother. I guess I was the managing trustee for all of the grandchildren until they became 27 years of age, at which time it was vested in them. He managed to leave each one of his children about $70,000, and interestingly, he left each one of his grandchildren about $70,000 worth of assets. And this is this gave everybody a start. And, if they hung on to things, it gave everybody a living. And some of the grandchildren have done very well, and some have done less well, but everybody, I'm sure, got a considerable amount of benefit out of what he accumulated and what he was able to leave them. My father was a very stern man. I'm sure as I remember my mother, she was soft and warm, and my dad was always stern and a real taskmaster. As you recall, after the war, he lived with us for a period of time, and we tried to give him his own quarters, but he ultimately had to build his own little house, and where he lived his remaining years, and as I mentioned before, died in June of 1955. I've never lost the love of land and love of farming, and my brother and I did quite a bit of farming together until just before he passed away. The year before he passed away, we terminated our joint ownerships, and each went our own ways, and he left his properties, his farming properties, which were the bulk of his estate, to his sons and daughter and his widow, and he left his widow also some solid income. And I've carried on the farming and have more acreage now than we had in the earlier years, but it's moved from the heart of Goleta Valley, which is now largely urbanized, up into the canyons, including the development of this Glen Annie Ranch where we live, and then now have a much larger ranch, 430 acres up in Winchester Canyon, and that's all developed into orchard, and we're raising avocados and lemons, and somewhat fortunately, my Dale and I, my wife and I, have developed and have accumulated some other properties, 2 large apartment complexes, and an office building, and one that I owned with a another partner, and then an industrial park in Santa Maria, and all of these things combined to give us a very fine living outside of farming. But the farming is sort of wild, but beautiful, and I intend to keep it up until my days are over. And I've tried to hire. I have hired the grandson of a first cousin who was raised in ranching, and I'm training him to run the ranches, and I'm also making sure that there's a reserve that hopefully will keep the ranches going. We have now about $1 million in that reserve, along with all of the equipment and improvements all paid for. So the Winchester Ranch has now been given half to, actually 3/8 to the trust for my 5 grandchildren, and all of whom are children of my son George Jr. And the other another 8 is owned by my daughter Patty, and I own the other half, and then I have a corporation which rents them, and the rent is wild. It sometimes is, some years it's 0, and some years it's $40,000 a piece to each one of the owners. So it's totally unpredictable, but I want to keep it in agriculture. As I mentioned, we're part of a large agricultural preserve, all of which is on the edge of the mountains north of Goleta, north of the University of California at Santa Barbara. And the program is to keep this in agriculture for as long as it's practical. It's only practical if you can irrigate, because we're in a semi-desert and we have to irrigate. During my lifetime, I've probably followed the footsteps of my late father to a considerable extent. As I mentioned, he gave us a start with $70,000. I haven't been fortunate in my selection of wives, and I gave my first wife, your mother, half of everything we'd accumulated up until 1959. My first financial statement is in 1942, and it shows that we had $110,000. At the time we were divorced in 1959, there was a little over $800,000, and she was given half. My second marriage was lasted 14, 15 years, and she had a first-class lawyer, and she got a couple of million. But I'm very fortunate to have found a woman that I certainly am happy to spend the rest of my life with. And we have now accumulated a good-sized fortune. We just do a financial statement that shows we're worth a little over 23 million. And this is has given us the opportunity to do a couple of things that please us very much. One is giving a good start to my wife's 2 children, who inherited from their father a considerable amount, and she joins me in giving to our trust for our grandchildren. Now each one has about $500,000. This should provide for an education and hopefully their start in their chosen occupation, their chosen business, their chosen profession, whatever it might turn out to be. We're going to probably give them some more, and one of the other things that pleases us very much is that we're active in several charities. My favorite is the scholarship program that I helped found when I was president of the Rotary Club here in Goleta. And it's now administered by the Santa Barbara Scholarship Foundation, and we currently are providing scholarships for young people going to Santa Barbara City College. And this pleases us very much. It's nice to be able to pass things on where they'll do a lot of good. We also are actively supporting the Goleta Valley Community Hospital, and my wife is on that foundation board, and we also are very active in supporting hospice, which takes care of terminally ill people. During my years of farming, I've been fortunate in having some very good years, and one of the things that I'm sort of proud of is that I won the Soil Conservation Award twice during my years of farming, both in connection with the Glenannie Ranch, converting it from a lot of washed hills to really a beautiful place where the soil is preserved, and the planting through the place's landscape, and where we have a very lovely home that you've taken pictures of the surroundings. And, all of the things that I've done with my life have been interesting, but not always successful. We have a saying, compared to the movie, nothing is very expensive, because symbolic of our adventure in movies, I have a check up there, I think for 38 cents, that's never been cashed, that represents a return on a Charles Bronson, Jason Robards movie that should have been extremely successful, but Bud Smith, a longtime friend of mine, and I did it together, and we had a nice big tax write-off, but the movie didn't prove that profitable by the time we got through paying interest, and the interest got up to 21%. By the time I got through paying the banks, I think we recorded a loss of about $5 million together, half and half, and Uncle Sam, of course, gave us a write-off of about half of that, or gave us tax credit for about half of that. So, one of the things that we can fortunately still kid about, but generally the things that we've done are pleasing. We have these apartment complexes we have are for people of moderate means, people who work in the area, and we try to keep the rents and the expenses down to where we're probably $40, $50 a month under market, and we have a waiting list everywhere. The medical building, we built a medical office building, and it houses doctors who work at the Goleta Valley Community Hospital, and it's a beautiful building. We've won awards for architecture and for landscaping, and we're pleased to have part party, an annual party for all of the tenants. And we have a lovely older couple managing one of the apartment complexes, and a young couple with a baby managing the one in Ventura. And we think we have a happy employee family. And we try to treat them well. And in connection with ranching, we are supporting about between 30 and 40 full-time employees. And most of them are married, have families here or in Mexico. If we ever quit farming, I'm not sure what all of them would do, but it pleases us to furnish their support. We try to treat them well. And I'm hoping that to meet my maker, I will be regarded as someone who did more than he took.
Hi, I'm George Cavalletto Jr. and this is 1980. Hi, I'm George Cavalletto Jr. and it's August 1990. And my son Danny and I have flown out here to Santa Barbara to visit with my father and decided to do some reminiscence. So we're going to go around to the various houses that I lived in as a child and then go talk to my dad, drive up and see my dad, and have him reminisce about his childhood and his father's life here. I hope you enjoy it.